I guess the first time that, and it wasn't in the early 70s yet that people were talking about it that much. Students were starting to grab onto it as an issue. I mean, one of the things was that for Japanese Americans, among all the ethnic students of color, came from the most educated backgrounds. Like many of us had parents, or at least one parent who went to college or something like that, so that we were seen as not being as discriminated against. You know, we were the model minority and, you know, all those kinds of things. And the Asian students started going back and looking at our history and realizing that there was a lot of one-upsmanship, who was more oppressed than who, you know, in those days. And when the Japanese American students could bring forward the camps, and the Chinese American students could talk about the Asian Exclusion Act and the wholesale killing of railroad workers in the late 1800s and things like that, then there was more unity and acceptance from the other ethnic groups. So that sort of thing happened in the early 70s, but it was really the mid-70s before all of that really started gelling with the Japanese American community as a whole. And even then, I remember I produced a documentary for Channel 9 with Wendy Tokuda, who was at King TV at that time. We co-produced a program about the internment tangentially, but more about Gordon Hirabayashi, who was a University of Washington student, one of the other three, who refused to go to the camps. And the Quakers backed him up and supported his case all the way through. But that was 1976. And that was my first television documentary, so I threw a big party, you know, the night it was on the air and everything like that, and my mother wouldn't come. You know, she didn't want to, like, deal with it. And a couple of years later, when the redress movement was really in full bore and there were those hearings around the country, she went down, I think it was in the King County Courthouse, I think. Anyway, she went down to hear the testimony. I think it was 3 days of testimony. And she took shorthand sat in the back and took shorthand of all the testimony that was given. So that was like a couple years later. The first day of remembrance was here in Seattle and was held at the Puyallup Fairgrounds, which was the staging place that all the Japanese Americans in this area had to report in before they got shipped off to the camps. And I think that was in 1976 or 77. The first congressional bill on redress was introduced by Mike Lowry, who was then member of Congress from Seattle. And Ruth Ann Carose was his staff person and played a key role in that. That bill, of course, didn't go anywhere. But Ruth Ann and her colleagues did a lot of work to educate and inform the Congressional Black Caucus, and they became among the strongest supporters of the bill that eventually passed.